I've always been a summer lover. Not for the parties or the booze, but for the warm air, the deep green woods, and endless hours outdoors. There's something about those long, sun-soaked days that makes me feel alive. Near my house, there's a nature preserve that spans almost 1,000 acres. It's the kind of place you could get lost in for hours, maybe even days, and still never see it all. Even after years of exploring it, there are parts of those woods that remain a mystery to me. One summer night, when I was around 17 or 18, two of my friends and I decided to camp deep inside the preserve. Ethan, the group's outdoorsman, had been pushing for it for weeks. He lived for this kind of stuff: campfires, knots, survival gear. Ryan, on the other hand, was more interested in the booze he'd brought along. Camping in the preserve was technically illegal, but we figured with a forest that huge, no one would ever find us if we trekked deep enough. We packed our bags, grabbed some beers, and headed into the woods. Ethan took the lead, as usual, his industrial-grade flashlight cutting through the darkness. Ryan walked behind him, already cracking open another drink. I trailed behind, listening to the distant hum of crickets and feeling the warmth of the night settling on my skin. After nearly half an hour of hiking through dense trees, we found a small clearing that seemed perfect. The trees formed a natural wall around it, giving us a sense of security, like we were completely cut off from the rest of the world. We set up the tent under Ethan's watchful eye, started a fire, and settled into our camping chairs. The fire crackled, and the night was alive with the familiar sounds of the forest. The air was warm, the drinks were flowing, and we felt invincible. We talked and laughed for hours, the flames dancing in front of us as the night wore on. Everything felt perfect until the whistle. It pierced through the air, sharp and sudden, like someone blowing a referee's whistle in the distance. But it wasn't distant enough. We all froze. It wasn't a normal sound, not like a bird or animal. It was sharp, unmistakable. The kind of whistle you'd hear at a ball game, except it was coming from deep within the woods, far too loud for the middle of nowhere. We froze. Ryan quickly shut off his speaker, and suddenly the forest around us fell into an eerie silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the usual chirps of insects. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us. Ethan, always the survivalist, immediately wanted to leave. His logic was sound. If someone was out there, it wasn't good news. But wandering through unfamiliar woods at 3 a.m. felt just as dangerous. Ryan and I argued to stay put, at least for a while. Maybe it was just some hiker passing by, we told ourselves. But the fear was creeping in, our low voices barely masking the growing tension. Just as I was about to suggest we put the fire out, something flickered in the corner of my eye. Small and fast, it zipped through the darkness, sailing right over Ryan's shoulder before landing square in the fire. A firecracker. I screamed as the flames hissed and sparked violently. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shot out of his chair and bolted into the trees, flashlights swinging wildly. Ryan and I scrambled to follow, stumbling over roots and branches, barely keeping up. We ran and ran, the adrenaline fueling us as we crashed through the underbrush. Finally, breathless, we stopped. Hearts pounding so hard it felt like they'd burst out of our chests. We stood there, panting in the darkness, listening. Nothing. No footsteps behind us, no rustling from the trees. It was as if no one had followed. But the tension didn't ease. My hands were shaking, and I could see the panic on Ryan's face. "We need to get the hell out of here," Ryan whispered harshly, pointing back toward the direction of the car. Ethan wasn't having it. He was adamant about going back. His tent, his gear, the fire was still burning, and he refused to leave it all behind. Reluctantly, we agreed. It sounded crazy, but Ethan had a point. If someone had meant to hurt us, wouldn't they have chased us? We retraced our steps cautiously, Ethan leading the way again with his flashlight. As we neared the clearing, the faint glow of the fire came into view through the trees. Relief washed over me for a second, that is, until Ryan grabbed my arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed silently ahead. My stomach twisted into knots as I squinted through the darkness. 3 figures were sitting around our fire, perfectly still, like statues. They were in our chairs, facing the flames, but they didn't move, didn't speak. The one whose face I could see had its mouth hanging open, staring lifelessly into the fire. There was something horribly wrong with them, something not human about the way they sat, unmoving, as if they weren't even breathing. The three of us stood frozen, too scared to take another step closer. My mind raced. Who were they? How had they gotten there so fast? What were they doing? Before we could figure out our next move, Ryan's foot scraped against a rock, causing him to curse under his breath. The sound felt impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. And then, without warning, the fire was snuffed out, like someone had thrown a blanket over it in the blink of an eye. Complete darkness swallowed the clearing. Panic surged through my body, and without thinking, I bolted. This time, the crashing sound of footsteps followed us, pounding behind us in the darkness. Whoever, or whatever, was back there was getting closer. I could hear branches snapping, heavy breathing, like something was right on our heels. None of us dared to look back. We ran faster than I thought possible, lungs burning as we tore through the woods, branches scratching at our arms and legs. My heart was hammering in my chest, adrenaline blurring everything but the desperate need to get out. When Ryan's car finally came into view, it felt like salvation. We practically dove inside, slamming the doors shut. For a moment, we sat there in stunned silence, the car's engine idling, all of us too scared to speak. I kept expecting something to burst from the trees, but nothing did. Whatever had chased us stopped short of the clearing. Somehow, we weren't followed out of the woods. But that didn't stop the fear from clinging to us all the way home. No one said a word on the drive back. Ryan's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, and I could see Ethan's hands shaking in his lap. My own thoughts were a mess, replaying the night over and over, trying to make sense of it. Those figures by the fire, the firecracker, the whistle. None of it added up. None of it felt real. The next morning, Ethan called me. He was adamant about going back for his camping gear. I thought he was insane, but he refused to leave it behind. Ryan wanted nothing to do with it. He wouldn't even answer his phone. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with Ethan. In the daylight, it didn't seem as terrifying. Maybe we'd overreacted, I told myself. Maybe it was just some messed up prank. When we arrived, the site looked eerily normal at first. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. The tent stood exactly where we'd left it, untouched from a distance. But as we got closer, something was off. The air was thick, heavy with a foul smell. It hit us before we even reached the tent, putrid, rotting, unmistakable. Ethan hesitated, then unzipped the tent, his face twisted in disgust. Inside, lying among his sleeping bag and supplies, was a dead rat. Its body was bloated and decomposing, covered in flies. We both stepped back, gagging. There was no way it had been there the night before. The stench, the state of its body, it had to have been placed there recently, but by whom and why? That was all I needed to see. I turned to Ethan and told him I was done. Whatever had happened that night, something or someone had been watching us, messing with us. I wasn't sticking around to figure out why. Ethan packed up his gear in silence, his face pale, the bravado from earlier completely gone. We left that preserve, and I haven't been back since. I don't care what we heard or what we saw. There's something out there in those woods. Something that doesn't want to be found, and after that night, I'm not about to go looking for it. About a month ago, I started noticing something strange, but let me give you some context first. I'm 22, and I still live with my parents. Not because I want to, but because I don't have a choice. We've never been well off. And most of the money I make goes towards keeping the house running. My relationship with my parents is far from perfect, and we bicker a lot. So when I'm not working or out with friends, I tend to stay in my room, away from everyone. I've always had a tough time growing up. But Fitness has been my escape. It's the one thing that clears my head and gives me a reason to leave the house. There's this park about 10 minutes from my place that I go to at night. It's got some workout equipment, pull-up bars, dip stations, stuff like that. It's peaceful there, especially late at night when no one's around. The park sits on a hill overlooking the city. I've always liked that view. It makes me feel like I'm above all the noise, both in my head and in the world. It's where I go to get away from everything. But one night, that place stopped feeling like my escape and started feeling like something much worse. It was a typical humid summer evening when I slipped out of the house, trying to escape the tension. By the time I pulled into the park, it was nearing 11 p.m., and the parking lot was empty. Just the way I preferred it. The stillness of the park always helped me clear my head, and the familiar routine of my workout began to do its job, letting me forget about everything for a little while. I was midway through my set on the pull-up bar, feeling the burn in my arms, when a sudden chill crawled up my spine. I don't know why, but I felt this overwhelming need to turn around, and when I did, I nearly lost my grip. Standing less than a foot away from me was a tall, ragged-looking man. His clothes were worn and dirty, his face gaunt, with greasy hair that clung to his forehead. I jumped back, my heart racing, and he responded with this deep, guttural laugh that made my skin crawl. He apologized, but the way he said it, like he was almost amused by my reaction, sent a wave of unease through me. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, his eyes scanning me in a way that felt too familiar. His presence, the way he stood so close without any warning, everything about him felt wrong. I asked him why he was so close, trying to keep my voice steady. "I live here," he replied casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That didn't make any sense. This was a public park, not some place where anyone lived. He went on to say that he sees me working out here all the time and asked if I could teach him some exercises. I'm not confrontational, and I just wanted to get back to my routine and leave. So I awkwardly told him I was about to finish up and then be on my way. As I turned back to the bar, I could feel his eyes locked on me, the weight of his stare heavy on my back. I tried to ignore it, focusing on finishing my set. But then I heard him quietly mutter something that made my blood run cold. He said my full name. I froze, gripping the bar tightly as my mind raced. How did he know my name? I hadn't told him, and we'd never met before. I was sure of it. Slowly, I turned to face him. He stood there with this wild, wide-eyed grin, like he knew something I didn't, something terrible. Panic surged through me, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. Without another word, I backed away from him and started walking towards my car. My hands were trembling as I unlocked the door, and I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes still burning into me. Before I drove off, I stole one last glance at the park. He was hanging from the pull-up bar, struggling to lift himself, copying the exact moves I had just done. I didn't look back again. The next morning, as I stepped out to head to work, I noticed an unmarked envelope sitting on my doorstep. It had my name on it, but there was no return address. I didn't think much of it at the time, just tossed it into my car, figuring I'd deal with it later. By lunch, I had forgotten about it until I sat in my car, trying to cool down from the heat of the day. I opened the envelope while eating my sandwich, expecting maybe a bill or some random mail. Inside were 10 photos. Photos of *me*. The first one was of me sitting in my car, probably from the night before. Then there was one of me at work, another of me working out at the park. My hands began to tremble as I flipped through the stack. The pictures got worse. One was of my house. And then, the last one, the one that made my stomach turn, was of me sleeping, taken from outside my bedroom window. I nearly dropped the photos. I felt sick, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it. The man from the park He had been following me, watching me, even in my most vulnerable moments. I shoved the photos back into the envelope and drove straight to the police station. I handed over the photos, explained everything about my encounter at the park, the way he had known my name, how he had been lurking so close for who knows how long. But all they said was they'd look into it. That was it. The next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside made me jump. Then, one night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to loud knocking at the front door. I didn't even get out of bed. I stayed perfectly still, paralyzed with fear, listening to the knocks echo through the silent house. Whoever it was left after a few minutes, but the fear didn't leave with them. A few days later, I found a sticky note on my car window. It was simple, just a heart drawn in black Sharpie. But it was enough to send me straight back to the police. This time, they finally agreed to open a stalking investigation, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. Weeks have passed now, and I still don't feel safe. My parents and I are looking for a new place, but money's tight, and it's taking longer than I'd hoped. Every night, I lie awake, listening, waiting for something to happen. I don't know if he's out there right now, watching from the dark, but I feel him. I haven't slept properly in weeks. I keep the curtains drawn, double-check the locks on every door and window, and sleep with my phone clutched in my hand. But the worst part, I know he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. For now, I'm just trying to make it through each night, keeping one eye open and praying that whatever happens next, I'll be ready for it. Last summer, I was 23 and far from being the life of any party. In fact, most of the time, the only reason I'd go anywhere was because my friends would guilt trip me into it. They were the wild type, always dragging me out of my comfort zone. This time was no different. My buddy John hit me up around 8 p.m., inviting me to some house party. It was last minute, but since I had nothing better to do, I reluctantly agreed. Besides, if I didn't go, I knew John would give me hell about it for days. John lived a few towns over, so we decided to drive separately. The whole ride over, I was already regretting my decision. I didn't know anyone at the party, and I wasn't really in the mood to socialize. But as I pulled onto the street, things got worse. John texted me, saying he couldn't make it, bailed on me at the last minute. I was pissed. Now I was sitting outside a stranger's house feeling like a complete idiot. I could have just left, but I had driven all the way there, so I figured I might as well make the most of it. Maybe it wouldn't be that bad. I walked up to the door and knocked, and to my surprise, the host, Carl, was actually pretty cool. He greeted me like we'd known each other for years, welcoming me in without a second thought. He wasn't one of those obnoxious party hosts either, just genuinely friendly and laid back. As I made my way through the crowd, people were surprisingly nice, despite not knowing who I was. A few drinks later, I was starting to loosen up. Hell, I was even having fun. But I didn't really know when to stop, and as the night dragged on, I could tell I'd overdone it. By 2 a.m., the alcohol had me spinning. My head was pounding, my stomach turning. I needed a break from the party. I stumbled upstairs, hoping to find an empty bathroom, but every door I knocked on was either locked or occupied. Desperation pushed me further through the maze of hallways until I found an old door at the end of the corridor. Without thinking, I pushed it open and climbed up a narrow set of stairs, finding myself in what seemed like an attic. The room was dusty and dark, but I didn't care. I just needed to pull myself together. There was a small window in the far corner, so I staggered over and pried it open, letting in a cool breeze. The rush of fresh air hit me, and I hung my head out, breathing it in as I tried to calm my swirling thoughts. For a moment it was perfect, quiet, peaceful. The chaos of the party felt miles away. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. On the roof. At first, I thought it was my drunken mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of shoes scraping across shingles. My curiosity got the best of me, and against all common sense, I climbed out of the window and onto the roof. I wobbled, trying to find my balance, and that's when I saw them. Two masked figures were crouching by another window, large bags slung over their shoulders. My foggy mind struggled to process what I was seeing, but it hit me hard. They were robbing the house. Panic surged through me, and in my clumsy state, I scuffed a loose shingle, the sound echoing across the roof. One of the burglars snapped his head toward me, his eyes locking onto mine through the dark. For a split second, I was frozen in place, heart pounding so loud I swore they could hear it. The burglars didn't waste any time. They quickly started making their way across the roof, trying to get away. And for some insane reason, maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was the alcohol, I followed them. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to call 911, but in my drunken clumsiness, I dropped it. The phone clattered loudly across the shingles, and one of the burglars stopped in his tracks. "Who's there?" he hissed, his voice sharp with fear and anger. I panicked, my brain scrambling for any kind of plan. I spotted a loose shingle beside me, grabbed it, and without thinking, hurled it toward them. It missed by a mile, but the noise was enough to startle one of them. He lost his footing, slipping down the roof and crashing into the gutter before tumbling to the ground below. The other burglar didn't hesitate. He jumped toward a nearby tree and scrambled down, vanishing into the shadows. Breathless and shaking, I rushed to the edge of the roof, peering down. The first burglar was groaning on the ground, barely moving. I rushed back inside, my heart racing and mind spinning. Sirens blared in the distance, getting closer by the second. Someone else must have called the cops because the party downstairs was still going strong, completely oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded outside. I forced my way through the crowd until I found Carl, still laughing and drinking with his guests. "Carl, you need to call the police. There's been a robbery," I blurted out, my words slurring a bit from the alcohol and panic. His expression shifted from confusion to shock. "What? Are you serious?" I quickly explained what had happened on the roof, and the atmosphere of the party changed in an instant. The music was cut, and people started murmuring, unsure of what was going on. When the police arrived, I gave them my side of the story, leading them to the burglar who had fallen from the roof. He was still on the ground, groaning, unable to move much. They arrested him on the spot, but his partner had escaped, slipping into the night without a trace. The party ended abruptly after that. People scattered, trying to get away from the situation. The lights in the house flipped on, and the place suddenly felt a lot less inviting. Carl thanked me, still in disbelief at what had gone down. I left shortly after, feeling dazed, unsure if I'd just lived through some crazy nightmare. Months passed, and the memory of that night faded, pushed aside by the usual grind of life. I hadn't thought much about it until one evening, while I was hanging out at John's place. Playing video games, we got a call from Carl. He invited us over for a few beers, and it was the first time I'd heard from him since the party. When I pulled up to Carl's house that night, something immediately felt off. The front door and all the windows were different, reinforced, heavy-duty. I could have sworn the house looked completely normal the last time I was here, but now everything seemed more fortified. Inside, Carl seemed relaxed, but when he started talking, his face darkened. He thanked me again for helping that night, but what he told us next was deeply unsettling. Apparently, the burglar who was caught refused to give up his partner's name, and he was serving a pretty long prison sentence for the robbery. But that wasn't the end of it. Not long after the incident, Carl's family started receiving threatening letters. Some of them even contained photos of Carl and his family members, taken from a distance, like they were being watched. The cops investigated, but they couldn't trace where the letters were coming from. It got worse. One night, Carl's mom noticed a suspicious car circling their house around 1 a.m., and a few days later, Carl's dad found evidence that someone had been messing around in their backyard. Things were moved, and it was clear someone had been there. In response, his family didn't take any chances. They installed high-end security systems, replaced all the doors and windows, and basically turned their house into a fortress. But despite all of that, the fear hadn't gone away. As Carl told us all this, I could see how it had worn on him. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, always on edge. Summer's approaching again, and I can't help but wonder, what if the other burglar is still out there? Watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The idea of him lurking in the shadows, holding a grudge, makes my skin crawl. And after everything that's happened, I'm not sure if this story is really over. This